A freezing Tuesday evening. A solitary man waiting for a bus. A patrol car slowing to a predatory crawl. It's a scene that plays out thousands of times across America. But this time, the officer picked the wrong target. He thought he was locking up a nameless, defenseless suspect. He didn't know he had just forcefully handcuffed one of the most ruthless, high-ranking federal prosecutors in the district. This is the story of a wrongful arrest, a shattered badge, and a $4.7 million mistake. Arthur Pendleton was a man who traded in the currency of control. At 42 years old, he was the deputy chief of the Violent Crimes and Racketeering section at the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts. He had spent his Tuesday meticulously dismantling a multi-million-dollar money laundering syndicate in front of a federal judge, his suit perfectly pressed, his arguments razor-sharp, his authority absolute. When Arthur spoke, FBI special agents took notes. When he frowned, defense attorneys reconsidered their plea deals. He was a man insulated by the immense, crushing weight of the federal government. But the federal government couldn't fix a dead alternator. At 7:45 p.m., deep in the subterranean parking garage of the federal courthouse, Arthur turned the key of his normally reliable Audi A6, only to be met with the agonizing, rapid-fire clicking of a dead battery. He sighed, resting his forehead against the leather steering wheel. The day had been an exhausting marathon of cross-examinations and sidebar arguments. He was drained. A tow truck would take hours. He decided to leave the car, take the T for a few stops, and catch the 66 bus the rest of the way to his home in Brookline. Before leaving the office, Arthur had stripped off his armor. The tailored Tom Ford suit jacket, the silk tie, and the crisp dress shirt were packed neatly into his leather messenger bag. In their place, he wore a faded gray Harvard Law hoodie, dark sweatpants, and a black wool beanie pulled low against the biting November wind. He looked nothing like the legal titan who had just commanded a courtroom. He looked like an ordinary, tired man trying to get home. The wind whipping off the Charles River was brutal. Arthur stood at the poorly lit bus stop at the corner of a gentrifying neighborhood that straddled the line between affluence and urban decay. The street lights flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the icy pavement. Arthur checked his phone. The bus was running 12 minutes late. He shoved his hands deep into his hoodie pockets, shifting his weight to stay warm, his breath pluming in the freezing air. 3 blocks away, Officer Derek Fowler was nursing a lukewarm coffee and a foul mood. Fowler was a 12-year veteran of the local police department, a man whose career had stalled at the rank of patrolman due to a long, quietly buried file of citizen complaints. He was cynical, restless, and deeply annoyed by the night's assignment. There had been a string of residential burglaries in the area over the past 3 weeks. The suspect description broadcasted by dispatch was frustratingly vague, the kind of dangerously broad net that invited lazy policing. Male, black, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing dark winter clothing. In a city of hundreds of thousands, on a night where the temperature hovered at 28 degrees, that description fit half the men walking the streets. But Fowler wasn't looking for nuance. He was looking for an arrest to get his lieutenant off his back. Fowler turned his cruiser onto the avenue. The street was mostly empty, save for the occasional passing car and a lone figure standing by a bus shelter. Fowler's eyes narrowed. He slowed the cruiser, the heavy tires crunching over patches of frozen slush. He took in the sight. A black man, tall, wearing a dark hoodie and a beanie, hands concealed in his pockets, standing in the shadows. To Arthur Pendleton, the approaching headlights were just a passing car. But as the vehicle decelerated, a blinding, high-intensity spotlight suddenly hit him square in the face. Arthur squinted, raising a gloved hand to shield his eyes. The vehicle was a police interceptor. The engine idled with a low, menacing rumble. Arthur felt a flicker of annoyance, but no fear. Why would he? He was a top-tier officer of the court. He assumed the officer was just doing a routine check, perhaps going to ask if he had seen anything suspicious. The driver's side door swung open. Officer Fowler stepped out, his hand resting casually but purposefully on the butt of his holstered service weapon. The heavy thud of his boots on the asphalt broke the quiet of the night. "Hey!" Fowler called out, his voice carrying the sharp, jagged edge of practiced authority. "Step out of the shelter. Keep your hands where I can see them." Arthur didn't immediately move. He was processing the command, his brilliant legal mind automatically analyzing the interaction. This was a Terry stop, an investigative detention. Under the Fourth Amendment, the officer needed reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime had been, was being, or was about to be committed. Standing at a bus stop was not a crime. "I said, get your hands out of your pockets and step into the light," Fowler barked, closing the distance. Arthur slowly withdrew his hands, making sure his palms were open and empty. He stepped forward into the harsh glare of the spotlight. "Officer," Arthur said, his voice calm, measured, and entirely devoid of the panic Fowler was used to hearing. "I'm just waiting for the 66 bus. It's supposed to be here in a few minutes. Is there a problem?" "I'll ask the questions," Fowler snapped. He stopped about 4 feet away, shining his heavy maglite directly into Arthur's eyes, despite the spotlight already illuminating the area. "What are you doing out here?" "I just told you. I'm waiting for the bus," Arthur replied, his tone remaining even, though a deep, simmering frustration began to take root in his chest. "My car broke down downtown." "You live around here?" "In Brookline," Arthur answered. "Got any ID on you?" Fowler demanded. This was the pivot point, the moment where the law separated the citizens from the subjects. Arthur knew the statutes of the state perfectly. It was a stop and identify state, but only if the officer had reasonable suspicion of a crime. Arthur was a black man in a hoodie, yes, but he was also a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the Constitution. He decided to establish the legal baseline. "Officer," Arthur said politely but firmly, "before I reach into my bag for my identification, could you please tell me what reasonable suspicion you have to detain me? Am I suspected of committing a crime?" The question hung in the freezing air. To Arthur, it was a standard procedural inquiry. To Officer Derek Fowler, it was an act of profound, unforgivable disrespect. Fowler's jaw tightened. The subtle shift in the officer's body language was instantaneous. The casual arrogance morphed into aggressive hostility. In Fowler's world, people on the street didn't use terms like reasonable suspicion. If they did, they were either sovereign citizens or smart alecks looking for a fight. Fowler despised both. "I don't need to give you a law lesson, buddy," Fowler sneered, taking a step closer, invading Arthur's personal space. The smell of stale coffee and peppermint gum wafted off the officer. "We've had burglaries in this area. You fit the description. Now, you're going to give me your ID, or I'm going to take you in for obstruction. Your choice." Arthur's mind raced. Fit the description. The oldest, most legally fragile excuse in the book. A vague description of a suspect does not grant law enforcement carte blanche to detain anyone who matches the race and gender of the suspect, especially absent any other suspicious behavior. Arthur knew that if he were a white man in a suit, this conversation wouldn't be happening. "I understand you're doing your job, officer," Arthur said, keeping his voice carefully modulated, avoiding any sudden movements. "But standing at a marked public transit stop is not suspicious behavior. I am declining your request for identification, as is my Fourth Amendment right, and I would like to know if I am free to go. Am I free to go? The magic words. In a courtroom, those words established whether a person was legally seized. Fowler's face turned an ugly shade of red. He wasn't used to being calmly outmaneuvered on the sidewalk. He was used to fear, compliance, or belligerence, all of which he knew how to handle with force. This cold, clinical defiance infuriated him. "You're not going anywhere," Fowler growled. Without warning, he lunged forward, grabbing Arthur by the upper arm with a bruising grip. Arthur gasped in shock, instinct causing his muscles to stiffen. "What are you doing? Do not touch me! Stop resisting!" Fowler yelled, the phrase a pre-programmed defense mechanism meant for his body camera and any potential witnesses. He yanked Arthur forward, spinning him around and slamming him chest first against the cold, plexiglass wall of the bus shelter. The impact knocked the breath out of Arthur. The sheer indignity of it, the physical violation, sent a surge of adrenaline through his veins. His cheek was pressed against the freezing, grime-covered glass. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the 66 bus finally pull up to the corner, its pneumatic brakes hissing. The doors opened, and a handful of passengers stared in wide-eyed horror at the scene. A police officer, roughly subduing a black man in a hoodie. "I am not resisting," Arthur stated loudly, ensuring his voice was clear for the officer's microphone. He deliberately went limp, offering absolutely zero physical opposition. He knew the statistics. He knew how quickly a bruised ego with a badge could turn a sidewalk into a crime scene. He would fight this, but not in the street. He would fight it in the arena he owned. Fowler kicked Arthur's legs apart, patting him down with unnecessary aggression. "Got a weapon on you? Needles? Anything that's going to poke me?" "I have no weapons," Arthur said, his voice muffled by the glass. "You are making an unlawful arrest. I am advising you to stop." "Shut your mouth," Fowler spat. He unclipped his handcuffs. The cold steel ratcheted tightly around Arthur's wrists, pinching the skin. The click of the locking mechanism echoed in the quiet street. Arthur Pendleton, the man who had authorized the wiretaps of international drug lords, the man who had the direct cell phone number of the Attorney General of the United States, was now handcuffed like a common vagrant. Fowler grabbed the thick leather strap of Arthur's messenger bag, yanking it off his shoulder, and then marched him toward the cruiser. "You wanted a law lesson? How about a lesson in respect?" Fowler muttered, opening the back door of the Interceptor. He placed a heavy hand on Arthur's head and shoved him into the cramped, hard plastic back seat. The door slammed shut, trapping Arthur in the suffocating, dark interior of the police car. It smelled of old sweat, vomit, and heavy industrial cleaner. He shifted his weight, the handcuffs biting into his wrists with every movement. Through the metal mesh of the partition, he watched Fowler confidently stride to the driver's side, clearly proud of his proactive police work. Fowler got in, picked up the radio microphone, and keyed it. "Dispatch, 14 Adam. I've got one in custody at 4th and Elm. Matches the description of the 459 suspect. He's being uncooperative. Transporting to the 14th precinct for booking." "Copy that. 14 Adam." The dispatcher's voice crackled back. Fowler looked at Arthur through the rearview mirror, a smug, self-satisfied grin on his face. "Hope you didn't have any big plans tonight, counselor." Arthur sat in the darkness, the shock beginning to wear off, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He looked back at Fowler's eyes in the mirror. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. "Officer," Arthur said softly, his voice carrying the chilling certainty of a judge delivering a life sentence. "You have no idea what you've just done." Fowler just laughed, threw the cruiser into drive, and sped off toward the station. The ride to the 14th District Precinct was a masterclass in psychological endurance. Fowler took the turns sharply, deliberately tossing his handcuffed passenger back and forth across the slick plastic seat. Arthur braced himself as best he could, refusing to give the officer the satisfaction of a complaint. Instead, Arthur catalogued everything. The exact time, the street names they passed, Fowler's badge number, which he had memorized the second the spotlight hit him, the exact phrasing of Fowler's threats. Arthur's mind was a steel trap, building a federal civil rights lawsuit piece by meticulous piece. The cruiser pulled into the secure sally port of the precinct. The heavy steel garage doors rattled shut behind them. Fowler hauled Arthur out of the back seat by the chain of the handcuffs, a tactic that sent a sharp spike of pain through Arthur's shoulders. "Walk," Fowler commanded, pushing him through the heavy reinforced doors and into the chaotic, fluorescent-lit booking area. The 14th District Precinct smelled exactly like desperation. It was a cacophony of ringing phones, shouting officers, and the low, defeated murmurs of the recently arrested. At the raised wooden booking desk sat Sergeant Thomas Gallagher, a tired, overweight desk sergeant who looked like he was counting the seconds until his pension kicked in. "What do we got, Fowler?" Gallagher asked, not looking up from his computer monitor. "Caught our prowler from the heights," Fowler announced proudly, bringing Arthur to a halt in front of the desk. "Spotted him loitering at the bus stop on Elm. Matched the description to a T. Refused to ID, got mouthy, tried to hit me with a bunch of constitutional bullshit. I'm writing him up for obstruction and resisting, and we can let the detectives see if they can tie him to the break-ins." Gallagher sighed, finally looking up. He took in Arthur's appearance. The beanie, the hoodie, the handcuffs. "All right, put him on the wall. Empty your pockets, buddy." Fowler roughly patted Arthur down, pulling out his keys, a pack of gum, and his cell phone. He then grabbed Arthur's expensive leather messenger bag and unceremoniously dumped its contents onto the booking counter. Out tumbled the neatly folded Tom Ford suit jacket, the silk tie, a few legal pads covered in dense, illegible notes, and a thick, heavy leather wallet. "Take his beanie off," Gallagher instructed. Fowler snatched the wool cap off Arthur's head, messing up his closely cropped hair. Arthur stared straight ahead, his expression carved from stone. He was playing the long game now. If he screamed and shouted about who he was, they would accuse him of trying to use his position to escape a lawful arrest. No, Arthur was going to let the system they abused so freely crush them under its own weight. "Name?" Gallagher asked, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Arthur remained silent. "Hey!" Fowler barked, slapping the back of Arthur's head. A casual, degrading strike. "The sergeant asked you a question." Arthur slowly turned his head to look at Fowler. The intensity in Arthur's eyes was so profound, so utterly devoid of fear, that Fowler unconsciously took a half-step back. "I am invoking my right to remain silent," Arthur said clearly to Sergeant Gallagher. "I will not answer any questions. I want my phone call." Gallagher rolled his eyes. "Another amateur lawyer. Fine. Put him in holding cell 3. I'll log his property." Fowler grabbed Arthur's arm and led him away from the desk, down a dingy, green-tiled hallway. He shoved Arthur into a cramped, foul-smelling cell containing a metal bench and a lidless toilet, uncuffed him through the bars, and slammed the heavy iron door shut. The deadbolt echoed with a final metallic clang. "Get comfortable," Fowler sneered through the bars. "You're going to be here a while." Arthur rubbed his raw, red wrists. He sat down on the cold metal bench, closed his eyes, and began to wait. Back at the booking desk, Sergeant Gallagher was annoyed. He hated logging property for uncooperative suspects. It meant more paperwork. He began sorting through the items scattered on the counter. He catalogued the cell phone, noting it was a high-end model. He logged the keys. He picked up the Tom Ford jacket. his fingers brushing against the luxurious fabric. Weird clothes for a burglar to be carrying around, Gallagher thought vaguely, but didn't dwell on it. Finally, he picked up the heavy leather wallet. It wasn't a standard bifold. It was thicker, secured with a small brass snap. Gallagher popped the snap open to look for a driver's license so he could properly identify their John Doe. As the wallet fell open, Gallagher didn't see a driver's license. He saw gold. A heavy, intricate gold shield gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the precinct. Above the shield, stamped in brilliant gold foil into the leather, were the words, "Department of Justice." Gallagher's breath caught in his throat. His heart skipped a beat. His hands began to tremble slightly as he flipped the leather flap to reveal the identification card opposite the badge. It featured a stern, professional photograph of the man currently sitting in holding cell 3. Next to the photo, bold black letters spelled out, United States Department of Justice, Arthur Pendleton, Assistant United States, Attorney Deputy Chief, Violent Crimes Section. The color completely drained from Sergeant Gallagher's face. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He stared at the ID as if it were a live hand grenade with the pin pulled. Assistant United States attorneys were the apex predators of the legal food chain. They didn't just prosecute criminals, they prosecuted police departments. They handled civil rights violations. They possessed the power to initiate federal probes that could dismantle entire precincts, force police chiefs into early retirement, and send dirty cops to federal penitentiaries. And the man in the photo wasn't just a low-level line prosecutor. He was a deputy chief. "Oh, sweet Jesus," Gallagher whispered into the empty booking area. He frantically looked over at the arrest report Fowler had hastily started typing on the adjacent terminal. Suspect matched description. Refused ID. Resisting arrest. It was a textbook boilerplate lie used to justify a bad stop. Gallagher knew it. Every cop in the building knew it. But this time, Fowler had used it on a man who literally taught seminars on how to dismantle those exact lattes in federal court. "Fowler!" Gallagher yelled, his voice cracking with panic. He stood up so fast his office chair rolled backward and slammed into a filing cabinet. "Fowler, get your ass out here right now!" Officer Fowler strolled out of the break room, a fresh cup of coffee in his hand, looking annoyed by the shouting. "What's the problem, Sarge? The guy throwing a tantrum?" Gallagher didn't speak. He just pointed a trembling, fat finger at the open wallet resting on the counter. Fowler walked over, a smirk playing on his lips. What? Did he steal a credit card or some... Fowler's voice died in his throat. He looked down at the gold shield. He looked at the ID card, the name, the title, the federal seal. The mug of coffee slipped from Fowler's hand, shattering against the linoleum floor, splashing dark brown liquid across his polished black boots. The silence in the booking area was deafening, broken only by the dripping of the spilled coffee. "Tell me," Gallagher said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "Tell me you didn't put hands on him, Derek. Tell me you just asked him to come down here voluntarily." Fowler stared at the badge, his tough guy facade crumbling into dust. He remembered the physical shove against the glass. He remembered the tight handcuffs. He remembered slapping the back of the man's head. I cuffed him, Sarge," Fowler stammered, feeling the ground opening up beneath his feet. "I tossed him in the back of the cruiser. I told him to shut his mouth." Gallagher closed his eyes, rubbing his temples as a massive migraine bloomed behind his eyes. The precinct was dead. They were all dead. "Get the captain," Gallagher breathed. "Wake him up. Call the chief. Call everybody." "Sarge, what do we do about the guy?" Fowler panicked, pointing toward the holding cells. "Should I go uncuff him? Should I apologize?" "Don't you go anywhere near that cell!" Gallagher roared, his fear morphing into rage. "You don't speak to him. You don't look at him. You just brought the wrath of the United States federal government down on this entire department, you stupid son of a bitch." In holding cell 3, Arthur Pendleton sat in the dark, listening to the muffled, chaotic shouting echoing down the hallway. He leaned his head back against the cold concrete wall. A small, grim smile finally touched his lips. The trap had closed. Now the real work would begin. Captain Robert Hayes was a man who valued his sleep. At 58 years old, he was 2 years away from a lucrative pension and a quiet retirement in Florida. When his bedside phone rang at 1:15 a.m., he answered it with the gruff irritation of a man used to dealing with drunks and minor domestic disputes. By 1:18 a.m., Hayes was speeding down the frozen interstate in his unmarked Ford Explorer, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, the emergency lights flashing silently into the black night. When Hayes burst through the double doors of the 14th District Precinct 20 minutes later, the atmosphere was suffocating. It felt less like a police station and more like a bunker moments before an artillery strike. Sergeant Gallagher was pacing behind the booking desk, sweating profusely. Officer Derek Fowler was sitting on a metal folding chair in the corner, staring blankly at the linoleum floor as if trying to memorize the tile pattern. "Where is he?" Hayes demanded, his voice a low, dangerous gravel. He didn't ask for a summary. Gallagher had already told him the catastrophic details over the phone. "Holding cell 3, Captain," Gallagher croaked, his hands shaking as he held out a ring of heavy brass keys. He hasn't made a sound, hasn't asked for a lawyer, hasn't asked for a phone call. "Of course he hasn't asked for a lawyer, you idiot," Hayes hissed, snatching the keys. "He is the lawyer. He's the guy who puts away cartels and dirty politicians. He's sitting in there building a federal indictment in his head." Hayes turned his furious gaze to Fowler. "You. Do not move. Do not speak. You don't text your union rep. You don't call your wife. You breathe when I tell you to breathe. If I find out you scrubbed your body camera footage, I will personally throw you off the roof of this building." Hayes straightened his uniform, took a deep breath to steady his racing pulse, and marched down the green-tiled hallway. The air grew colder the closer he got to the cells. He stopped in front of cell 3. Through the rusted iron bars he saw Arthur Pendleton. The deputy chief of the violent crimes section was sitting perfectly still on the metal bench, his hands resting on his knees. He looked up as Hayes approached, his expression utterly blank. "Mr. Pendleton," Captain Hayes started, his voice strained with forced diplomacy. He fumbled with the keys, his hands betraying his panic. "There has been a colossal misunderstanding. I am Captain Robert Hayes, the commanding officer of this precinct. I am opening this door right now, and you are free to go. With our deepest, most profound apologies." The heavy deadbolt clicked. The iron door swung open, screeching on its hinges. Arthur did not stand up. He did not move towards the open door. He simply sat there, his dark eyes locking onto the captain's face. "Captain Hayes," Arthur said, his voice smooth, resonant, and entirely terrifying. "Are you unarresting me?" Hayes swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. You are completely free to go. We'll have an officer drive you home immediately." "Anywhere you want to go." "I see," Arthur replied slowly. "And under what legal authority was I detained, transported, and locked in this cage?" "It was a mistake, sir. The officer—" "A mistake is a typo on a parking ticket, Captain," Arthur interrupted, his tone chillingly polite, but slicing like a scalpel. "What your officer engaged in was an unlawful seizure under the Fourth Amendment, a deprivation of my civil rights under color of law in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 242 and felony battery. He detained me without reasonable suspicion, arrested me without probable cause, and physically assaulted me because I asked him to articulate his legal reasoning. Hayes wiped the sweat from his brow. "Mr. Pendleton, please, let's step into my office. We can get you some coffee, get your belongings." "I am not stepping into your office, Captain," Arthur said, finally standing up. He stepped into the light of the hallway, and Hayes winced as he saw the angry, red indentations on Arthur's wrists, where the cuffs had bitten into the skin, and a faint red bruise forming on his left cheek from the bus shelter glass. "I want my release processed officially," Arthur commanded, stepping into the corridor. "I want a copy of the booking sheet showing the time I was brought in. I want the property receipt. I want the CAD dispatch log for the initial stop. And I want the badge number of the officer who assaulted me. I will not be slipping quietly out the back door, so your department can sweep this under the rug." Hayes knew he was cornered. Complying meant handing over the exact documentation Arthur would use to crucify them in civil court. Refusing meant escalating an already radioactive situation with a federal prosecutor. "Of course, sir," Hayes conceded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'll have the desk sergeant prepare the paperwork immediately." 10 minutes later, Arthur stood at the booking desk. He methodically dressed himself, slipping into his Tom Ford suit jacket, adjusting his collar, and placing his gold badge back into his leather bag. The transformation was striking. He went from looking like a street-level suspect to a man who commanded empires. He took the stack of papers Sergeant Gallagher, trembling, handed over. Arthur read every single line before folding them neatly into his breast pocket. He then looked directly at Officer Fowler, who was still sitting in the corner, pale and trembling. "Officer," Arthur said. The room went dead silent. "In my line of work, I see a lot of bad men. But the ones who hide behind a badge to bully people on the street, they are my absolute favorite to prosecute. Get a very good lawyer." Without another word, Arthur Pendleton turned and walked out the front doors of the precinct, disappearing into the freezing night. The next morning, the sun rose over a city, blissfully unaware of the legal earthquake that was about to hit. At 8 a.m. sharp, Arthur walked into the John Joseph Moakley United States Courthouse. He bypassed his own office and took the private elevator straight to the top floor. He walked past the shocked administrative assistants and pushed open the heavy oak doors to the office of William Covington, the United States Attorney for the District of Massachusetts. Covington, a silver-haired legal veteran with a reputation for political ruthlessness, was sipping coffee and reading the morning briefing. He looked up, surprised. "Arthur? You look like you went 10 rounds with a freight train. What happened to your face?" Arthur dropped his leather messenger bag onto Covington's mahogany desk. "Bill, I need a leave of absence, effective immediately." Covington frowned, setting his coffee down. "A leave? We're impaneling the grand jury on the waterfront corruption case on Thursday. You can't just walk away." "What's going on?" Arthur sat down and laid out the events of the previous night with the dispassionate, clinical precision of a medical examiner detailing an autopsy. He described the stop, the assault, the ride to the station, and the panic at the booking desk. By the time Arthur finished, Covington's face had turned a mottled, furious red. He slammed his hand flat on the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "They did what? To my deputy chief?" "To a citizen, Bill," Arthur corrected softly. "They did it to a citizen. It just happened to be me." "I'm calling the mayor right now," Covington barked, reaching for his phone. "I'm calling the chief of police. I'll have that officer's badge on my desk by noon, and I'll have the FBI open a civil rights probe by 1 p.m. "No," Arthur said firmly. "If you do that, it becomes a political favor. A quiet firing behind closed doors to appease the U.S. Attorney's Office. The department learns nothing. The public sees nothing. And tomorrow night, another black man in a hoodie gets his face slammed against the glass. Covington paused, his hand hovering over the receiver. "So, what's your play, Arthur?" "I am stepping back from my federal duties to avoid a conflict of interest. I'm hiring private counsel, and I am going to sue the city, the police department, and Officer Derek Fowler for a sum so catastrophically large that they will have no choice but to accept a federal consent decree overhauling their entire patrol division." Covington leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Who are you hiring?" 3 hours later, Arthur was sitting in the sleek, glass-walled conference room of Richard Caldwell. Caldwell was the most feared civil rights attorney on the Eastern Seaboard, a man who had extracted hundreds of millions of dollars from corrupt municipalities and possessed a theatrical flair for media warfare. "They messed up, Arthur. They messed up on a biblical scale," Caldwell said, pacing the length of the conference room, energized by the details. "We hit them with a 42 U.S. C-section, 1,983 lawsuit. We claim false arrest, excessive force, malicious prosecution, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I want the systemic issues addressed, Richard," Arthur warned. "This isn't just about a payout." Fowler was confident. He didn't think twice about lying on the arrest report. That means he's done it 100 times before, and his supervisors have signed off on it 100 times. "We will rip their internal affairs records wide open during discovery," Caldwell promised. But the police department wasn't going to roll over and die. Within 48 hours, whispers began leaking to the local press, orchestrated by the aggressive local police union. Anonymous sources claimed that Arthur was acting erratically, that he matched the description of a violent felon, and that the physical force used was minimal and within department guidelines. They were trying to control the narrative. They claimed Fowler's body camera had malfunctioned during the initial encounter, a convenient, predictable lie. They didn't know Arthur was already 3 steps ahead. The day after his release, while the police department was frantically trying to get their story straight, Arthur had quietly hired a private investigator to execute a preservation letter to the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority. The police forgot about the 66 bus. When the bus had pulled up to the stop, its high-definition, forward-facing security camera had a perfectly clear, brightly lit view of the entire bus shelter. 7 days after the arrest, Richard Caldwell held a press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse. Every major news network was present. Microphones bristled on the podium. Behind Caldwell stood Arthur Pendleton, wearing a pristine navy suit, his face calm and unreadable. Last Tuesday, a distinguished federal prosecutor was treated like a violent animal simply for standing at a bus stop, Caldwell thundered into the microphones, his voice echoing across the plaza. The police union has spent the last week lying to the public. They claimed Mr. Pendleton was aggressive. They claimed the officer's body camera was broken. They claimed the use of force was justified. Caldwell smiled, a shark smelling blood in the water. He gestured to a large television screen set up next to the podium. "We don't need their broken body cameras. We have the truth." Caldwell hit play. The high-definition video from the transit bus played for the assembled press. There was no audio, but the visuals were damning. It showed Arthur standing peacefully, hands visible. It showed Fowler lunging, unprovoked. It showed the brutal, violent slam into the glass. It showed absolute compliance from Arthur, and total, unchecked aggression from the officer. Gasps rippled through the press corps. Camera shutters fired in a deafening crescendo. "Today," Caldwell announced over the noise. "We are filing a $4.7 million civil rights lawsuit against the city, the police department, and Officer Derek Fowler. Furthermore, we are formally petitioning the Department of Justice to investigate the systematic, racially biased policing practices of this department." The trap hadn't just closed. It had snapped the department's credibility in half. The war had officially begun. The video broadcast across the national news acted as a lit match dropped into a powder keg. Overnight, the narrative flipped from a local dispute into a national scandal. The city's crisis management PR firm was drowning, and the police union's bluster evaporated the moment the high-definition transit video hit the internet. But public outrage was only the opening salvo. The real execution was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, exactly 4 months after the arrest, inside the sterile, glass-paneled conference room of Richard Caldwell's downtown law firm. It was time for the depositions. Sitting across the long mahogany table was Bradley Whitman, the chief litigator for the city. Whitman was a brilliant, pragmatic attorney who had made a career out of putting out fires started by reckless cops. But looking across the table at Richard Caldwell and a stone-faced Arthur Pendleton, Whitman knew he wasn't here to win. He was here to minimize the bleeding. Next to Whitman sat Officer Derek Fowler. Fowler had aged 5 years in 4 months. He had been placed on unpaid administrative leave following the press conference, stripped of his badge and his gun. He looked pale, wearing an ill-fitting grey suit, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Every time he glanced at Arthur, he quickly looked away. Arthur simply sat with his hands folded, watching Fowler with the cold, unblinking intensity of a hawk circling a wounded rabbit. A court reporter sat at the head of the table, fingers hovering over her stenotype machine. "State your name for the record," Caldwell began, adjusting his glasses. "Derek Andrew Fowler," he mumbled. "Speak up for the reporter, please," Caldwell instructed sharply. For the next 3 hours, Caldwell walked Fowler through the agonizing minutiae of his career, his training, and the night of November 12th. Caldwell was a surgeon with his questions, slowly boxing Fowler into a corner, built entirely out of the officer's own sworn police reports. "Officer Fowler," Caldwell said, pulling a document from a thick manila folder. "In your official arrest report, you stated that you approached Mr. Pendleton because he perfectly matched the description of a suspect wanted for a string of residential burglaries in the area. Is that correct?" "Yes," Fowler answered defensively. "Dispatch put out a BOLO for a black male, tall, wearing dark winter clothing, and you believed Mr. Pendleton, who was standing at a brightly lit public bus stop reading an email on his phone, was actively fleeing a burglary." "I had reasonable suspicion to initiate an investigatory stop," Fowler recited, clearly parroting Whitman's coaching. Caldwell smiled, a terrifying, predatory grin. He reached into his briefcase and produced a thick stack of paper bound with a blue legal cover. He slid it across the table. "Exhibit C, Mr. Whitman, for your review." Whitman frowned, flipping open the document. "Officer Fowler," Caldwell continued, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "This is a certified transcript of the Central Dispatch logs for the 14th District on the night in question. Let me direct your attention to page 12, time-stamped 7:42 p.m. 8 minutes before you activated your emergency lights and approached my client." Fowler swallowed hard. The silence in the room suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. "According to this log," Caldwell read aloud, "Unit 14 boy apprehended the burglary suspect hiding in an alley on 9th Street. The suspect was a 19-year-old male wearing a bright red puffer jacket and blue jeans. Dispatch broadcasted this apprehension on the primary tactical channel, the exact channel your radio was tuned to. Dispatch cleared the bolo at 7:43 p.m. Whitman closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. He hadn't seen this. The police department had buried the dispatch log. Officer Fowler. Caldwell leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You knew the suspect had already been caught. You knew the bolo was cancelled. You had absolutely zero legal justification to stop my client. You didn't stop him because he matched a description. You stopped him because you wanted to harass a black man in a hoodie who had the audacity to exist in your patrol sector. Isn't that right? I didn't hear the radio call, Fowler stammered, sweat beading on his upper lip. It was noisy. My radio volume must have been down. Your volume was down? Caldwell countered instantly, producing another sheet of paper. Then how did you respond to a status check from the dispatch at 7:45 p.m. on that exact same channel? You acknowledged the apprehension of the suspect, Officer Fowler. I have the audio recording. Fowler's face drained of all color. He looked at Whitman for help, but the city attorney was staring a hole through the mahogany table. Let's move on to the body camera, Caldwell said, relentless. You claimed in your sworn internal affairs statement that your Axon body camera malfunctioned during the physical altercation, that it shorted out due to the cold. That's what happened, Fowler insisted, his voice trembling. Technology fails. Arthur Pendleton finally shifted in his seat. He leaned forward, locking eyes with Fowler. The sheer contempt in Arthur's gaze made Fowler physically shrink in his chair. Officer Fowler, Caldwell said, we subpoenaed the metadata logs directly from Axon Enterprises, the manufacturer of your camera. Exhibit D. According to the internal software audit, the camera did not short out. The camera did not experience a battery failure. At 7:48 p.m. and 12 seconds, exactly 30 seconds before you stepped out of your cruiser to assault my client, the camera was manually powered down. The power button was held for 3 seconds until the unit disengaged. A collective gasp seemed to suck the air out of the room. Spoliation of evidence. Intentional destruction. It wasn't just a civil rights violation anymore. It was a federal crime. You turned it off, Caldwell stated, not asking a question. You turned it off because you knew exactly what you were about to do, and you didn't want a record of it. You just didn't count on the MBTA bus arriving right on time. Objection, Whitman interrupted weakly, though he knew it was pointless in a deposition. Counsel is badgering the witness. I'm finished, Caldwell said, slamming the folder shut. Mr. Whitman, I suggest we take a brief recess. I believe you and your client have some very difficult realities to discuss. As Caldwell and Arthur stood up to leave the room, Arthur paused by the door. He looked back at Fowler, who was now trembling uncontrollably. His career, his freedom, and his life reduced to ash in the span of 30 minutes. I told you, Arthur said softly, his voice cutting through the tension like glass. You had no idea what you had done. The collapse of the city's defense was absolute and spectacular. 2 weeks after the deposition, Mayor Thomas Harding personally requested an emergency mediation session. The city was facing a financial and public relations apocalypse. If Caldwell took this case to a federal jury with the dispatch logs, the Axon metadata, and the transit video, the damages wouldn't just be $5 million. A jury would award $20 million just to punish the department. The mediation took place in a neutral, high-end arbitration facility overlooking the harbor. Mayor Harding, Chief of Police William Russo, and Bradley Whitman sat on one side. Arthur and Caldwell sat on the other. The mayor looked exhausted. Mr. Pendleton, Mr. Caldwell, the city is prepared to admit fault. What happened to you was a disgrace. We are prepared to offer a settlement of $1.5 million, tax-free, contingent upon a standard non-disclosure agreement. We want to make this right, and we want to move forward." Richard Caldwell didn't even look at his notes. He simply looked at Arthur. For the first time in the mediation, Arthur Pendleton spoke. "Mayor Harding," Arthur said, his voice calm, projecting the undeniable authority of a deputy chief prosecutor. "Let me explain the reality of your situation. You are not buying my silence. You are not sweeping this under the rug with a nuisance payout and an NDA. I am a sworn officer of the United States Department of Justice. My duty is to the law, not to your municipal budget." Arthur slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "These are my terms. There will be no negotiation." Whitman picked up the paper and read it. His eyes widened. "First," Arthur continued, "the financial compensation will be exactly $4.7 million, not a penny less. Second, Officer Derek Fowler will be terminated immediately, with cause, completely severing his right to a municipal pension. Third, Captain Robert Hayes and Sergeant Thomas Gallagher will be forced into early retirement for failure to supervise and falsification of public records." The police chief shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Pendleton, we can't just dictate union pension terms." "I strongly suggest you figure it out, Chief," Arthur cut him off instantly. "Because if you don't, my fourth demand goes into effect. I will forward the unredacted discovery file from this civil case to the Civil Rights Division of the FBI. I will personally ensure they open a pattern or practice investigation into the 14th District. They will put your entire department under a federal consent decree. They will dictate your hiring, your firing, your training, and your budget for the next 10 years. You will lose control of your own police force." The threat hung in the air, heavy and lethal. A federal consent decree was the ultimate nightmare for any mayor or police chief. It meant millions of dollars in compliance audits and total loss of autonomy. Arthur wasn't just holding a gun to their heads. He was holding a tactical nuke. $4.7 million, Mayor Harding whispered, staring at the paper. "Arthur, that's going to cripple our discretionary fund for the year." "Then next year," Arthur replied coldly, "I suggest you spend your discretionary fund on teaching your patrolmen the Fourth Amendment." The silence stretched on for 2 agonizing minutes. Finally, Mayor Harding picked up a silver pen, uncapped it, and signed the term sheet. It was over. The fallout was swift and merciless. Within 48 hours, the city announced the historic $4.7 million settlement. The terms were completely public. There was no NDA. Derek Fowler was publicly fired. 2 days later, he was indicted by a federal grand jury for deprivation of rights under color of law and obstruction of justice for tampering with his body camera. He would eventually plead guilty to avoid a trial, receiving a 36-month sentence in a federal correctional institution. He lost his badge, his freedom, and his pension. Captain Hayes and Sergeant Gallagher quietly submitted their retirement papers, vanishing into obscurity, their reputations permanently tarnished. The 14th District Precinct was gutted and overhauled, its command structure replaced by reform-minded officers terrified of federal oversight. As for Arthur Pendleton, the $4.7 million was wired into a trust. He donated $2 million to a legal defense fund dedicated to providing high-powered representation for marginalized citizens who were victims of police brutality. He kept the rest. On a crisp Monday morning, 6 months after a dead car battery changed the course of his life, Arthur walked back into the John Joseph Mockley United States Courthouse. He took the elevator up, bypassed the administrative assistants, and walked into his office. His tailored Tom Ford suit fit perfectly. The heavy gold badge of the Department of Justice rested securely in his pocket. He sat down at his desk, opened a fresh case file, and picked up his pen. He was the deputy chief of the violent crimes section, and he still had a lot of work to do. The story of Arthur Pendleton is a chilling reminder of how quickly power can be abused when officers believe they are operating in the dark. Derek Fowler thought he had found an easy victim, someone whose rights he could crush without consequence. He learned the hard way that accountability can come from the most unexpected places. It's a powerful lesson in knowing your rights, standing your ground, and forcing a broken system to answer for its crimes. If this real-life legal takedown made your blood boil and your